Hello guys, how are you? This is Miss Sarah. In today's lesson, we're going to talk about the relative clause and the relative pronouns and how to use them. First, what is pronouns? We use pronouns instead of repeating the same noun over and over again. Let's see this example here. Esa watched the sun warmed Esa smiled. Esa watched the sun, it warmed him, he smiled. So instead of just repeating the sun and Esa, we just replacing it, him, and he as pronouns in place of the names. So what are our relative pronouns? Relative pronouns introduce us into a relative clause. Starts the relative clause by a relative pronoun, and the relative pronoun actually replaces the noun or the thing that we're talking about. So what are they? It's who, which, where, when, whose, and that. Who in place of persons, which is place of things and animals, where in place of places, when in place of time, whose in place of positions and property, and that actually can use for anything of that in place of whose, when, where, or any of these other relative pronouns. We can use that instead. The camel which was covered in sand refused to move. The camel, we can replace it by which. And which is our relative pronoun, and which was covered in sand is our relative clause. It bared its teeth which were yellow and crooked. Its teeth. It can be replaced by which as a relative pronoun, and which were yellow and crooked are our relative clause. Esa, who had heard a cry, cautiously approached. So we're placing who instead of Esa, and who had heard a cry is our relative clause, and it shows us the relation between the clause to the noun or the pronoun. That's what relative clause pronouns does. He gently pulled at the bridle that the camel was wearing. So the bridle is replaced by that the camel was wearing is the whole relative clause, and that replaces the bridle, and it shows us the relation between the relative clause and the clause. So what are the relative clause? The relative clause gives us more information about the noun or the pronouns that we're talking about. The child wailed. If you want to say more about the child who was wrapped in finest, softest cotton wailed. Or the child who had huge black pearls for eyes wailed. The child who had been hidden inside the woven basket wailed. So the relative clause gives us more information about the pronoun and the person or the things that we're talking about. Mariama knew the desert. If you want to say more about the desert, you would say, Mariama knew the desert which was vast and beautiful. So we're going to place which because we're talking about a desert, and then you place the information that you want to say, which was vast and beautiful, where many travelers needed guiding, or that become her home. So In place of the desert, we place which was vast and beautiful, where many travelers needed guiding, and that became her home. Well, let's notice here that sometimes we put which, and the second one we have put where, and the third time that. So that can replace any of other relative pronouns, and that's what I said earlier. But notice the first one, which was vast and beautiful. Here we're describing the desert. We're not talking about the desert as its place, as a place. So instead we replace it by which, because we are describing the desert. We're not saying the exact place. We're not talking about her as a place. We're talking about her as a thing, and we're describing it. So that's why we use which here, which was vast and beautiful. But the second one, actually we're talking a desert, about the desert as it's a place. That's why we have to choose where, because where many travelers needed guiding. We're here speaking about the desert. We're talking about the desert as a place, not as a thing that we're describing. Let's see here. The travelers who need a guide were always sent to Issa. If we want to identify the relative clause, Issa, who loves the desert, was never lost in it. The camel which was carrying Miriam protected her from the storm. Miriam wore a pendant that was the shape of a half star. Miriam's straw grew up in the desert where she was found. Let's see, where are they? The first one, who needed a guide. This is our relative clause. The second one, who loves the desert, is our relative clause. The third one will be which was carrying Miriam. This is our relative clause. The fifth one, that was the shape of half a heart, oh, a half a star. This is our relative clause. The sixth and the last one, where she was found. This is our relative clause. Let's identify the relative pronoun. The first one was who. The second one was who. The third one was which. The fourth one was that. And the last one is where. The first one, we're actually talking about persons, so in place of that person we're going to choose who. The second one is the same. The third one is the camel, so we choose which. The first one we choose that, and we said we can replace it, that can replace any other pronoun, relative pronoun. So the last one is where, and we were talking about the desert, so as a place, so we're going to say where. So when the relative clause comes after the main clause, we do not usually separate the clause with a comma. As for this one, Jan wriggled his nose, which was sniffed the down air. So we have the main clause at the first or at the beginning, and the second comes a relative clause. We don't need a comma for that. So a comma actually is not necessary here. Sometimes a relative clause is emptied in the main clause. Isaac cared for Miriam as his own. This is our first clause. So if you want to say more about Emma, let's see. The relative clause needs to be next to the noun. So we're going to separate them. Esa as a main clause and cared for Miriam as his own is the other part of the main clause, and in the middle we're going to place our relative clause, because our relative clause need to be next to the pronoun or the main the pronoun or the person that we're talking about or the thing that we're talking about. So Isa, who was the best guide in the land, cared for Mariama as his own. Commas separating these clauses because the relative clause breaks up the main clauses. So we have to break the main clause. If we breaks up the main clause, we need to put a comma. So where are the relative clause which need to be punctuated with commas? We're going to identify the relative clause and we're going to punctuate them with commas if needed. The first one, Mariama climbed the steep path, which was just a crack in the rock. So which was just a crack in the rock is our relative clause. The next one, the mountain peaks which were grooved like ancient teeth touched the clouds. We're going to choose which were grooved like ancient teeth. This is our relative clause. Mariama, who had never seen anything so beautiful, cried aloud. So our relative clause is going to be who had never seen anything so beautiful. The next one, that drifted up from the valley. She spotted a little twist of smoke that drifted up from the valley. And our relative clause will be that drifted up from the valley. The fifth and the last one, Isa, who was waiting for her, asked what she had seen. We're going to choose who was waiting for her as our relative clause. Let's see the punctuation. The first one actually is not going to take any comma because the main clause actually is at the beginning and we're not separating the main into two parts. We're just placing which was just crack in a rock. Our relative clause is going to be at the end, so we don't need a comma here. The second one, actually we're going to need a comma at the beginning and at the end of the relative clause. The second one, actually we're going to do the same thing because it's separating our main clause. So our relative clause is going to need two commas, one at the beginning and one at the end. Isa, who was waiting for her, asked what she had seen. We're going to need a comma at the beginning and again at the end. Commas are used when the relative clause is empty. So a relative clause can also relate to a whole sentence or a clause. Isa's sight was failing. So Isa's sight was failing, which worried Mariama. So the failing for the sight as relative clause relates to the whole sentence. It's not the sight which worried Mariama, it's the failing of it that worries her.